Today, we're diving deep into bipolar disorder, a condition that's so often misunderstood. And to do that, we're pulling our insights straight from a landmark state-of-the-art review published in the journal World Psychiatry, giving us the absolute latest understanding from the field. So here's our roadmap. We'll start with the official definition, then get into why this condition is so tricky to spot in the first place. We'll also break down how it differs from its lookalikes, get a handle on how common it is, and finally, really unpack the profound impact it has on a person's life. All right, let's jump right in with the absolute fundamentals, the diagnostic foundation. It's so important to get this right, to understand not only what bipolar II is, but just as crucially, what it is not. Okay, so if you look at both the major diagnostic manuals, the DSM-5 and the ICD-11, the core recipe is the same. You need at least one major depressive episode and at least one hypomanic episode. But here's the key, the absolute deal breaker. There can be no history of a full manic episode. That's the bright line that separates bipolar II from bipolar I. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Even the experts have slightly different ways of defining that high state of hypomania. You can see here the DSM-5 is very specific. It requires symptoms to last for at least 4 days in a row. The ICD-11, on the other hand, is a bit more flexible, using the phrase at least several days. It seems like a small difference, but in diagnostics, that little bit of wiggle room can be a really big deal. And believe it or not, this isn't all completely settled science. Drawing that exact line between a true hypomanic episode and just a normal period of feeling really good, well, that, along with the criteria we just talked about, has been the subject of some pretty intense debate among researchers for years. This complexity leads us straight into one of the biggest problems with bipolar II, how it actually shows up in the real world. You could call it a master of disguise, because the way it presents in a doctor's office is often why it gets missed entirely. And this really gets to the core of the whole challenge. Think about it. People don't typically make a doctor's appointment when they're feeling unusually energetic, productive, and on top of the world. They seek help when they're being crushed by depression. So right from the start, the clinician is often only seeing half the picture. And this number, wow, this just perfectly illustrates the scale of that imbalance. Research shows that for every single day a person with bipolar II might experience hypomania, they can endure up to 39 days of depression. That just shows you how much the depression completely dominates the illness. Let's look at that another way. When a person with bipolar II is actually symptomatic, more than 80% of that time is spent in a depressive state. Hypomania is this much smaller piece of the pie, making it a tiny and very easily missed target for a diagnosis. So why is hypomania so hard to pin down? Well, for one, the episodes themselves can actually feel good. You might feel super productive, creative, and energetic, so you wouldn't report it as a problem. And second, sometimes hypomania doesn't feel good at all. It can be mixed with irritability and agitation, which can look a whole lot like the agitation you see in depression, further masking what's really going on. And the direct fallout from all of this is that bipolar II is very, very often misdiagnosed as just regular major depression. And that's not just a clerical error. It's a huge problem because it can lead to treatments that aren't just ineffective, but can actually make the underlying bipolar illness worse over the long term. Okay, so given how incredibly hard this can be to spot, it's so important to know how clinicians work to tell bipolar II apart from other conditions that can look so similar on the surface. So when a patient comes in with depression, clinicians are often looking for what you might call a bipolar signature. These are red flags or clues that suggest something more is going on. Things like depression starting at a very young age, having many separate episodes that start and stop suddenly, or not getting better on standard antidepressants, all these things scream, hey, we need to look a little deeper here. But that brings us to what is probably one of the toughest diagnostic challenges in all of mental health, telling the difference between bipolar II and borderline personality disorder. They share so many features, like mood swings and impulsivity, that there's a huge amount of overlap. This Venn diagram does a great job of breaking it down. You see that overlap in the middle, things like impulsivity and suicidal behavior? But the key difference is the pattern. In bipolar II, the mood changes happen in distinct episodes that last for days or weeks, often with stable periods in between. In borderline personality disorder, the instability is more of a constant, moment-to-moment experience, and it's almost always triggered by something happening in their relationships. So now that we have a better handle on diagnosis, Let's talk about screening. How do we identify potential cases out in the world? And just how common is bipolar II, really? Well, there are several screening questionnaires that can help flag people who might need a closer look. You can see tools like the MDQ and the HCL32 here. Each one focuses on slightly different things and has a different sensitivity, which is basically how good it is at catching potential cases. Some are better at catching bipolar I, while others are designed specifically to sniff out those subtle hypomanic symptoms. And I cannot stress this point enough. These are just screening tools. They are not a diagnosis. Getting a high score on one of these questionnaires doesn't mean you have bipolar disorder. What it means is that it's a really good idea to go talk to a professional for a full, proper evaluation. That's the only way to get a real diagnosis. Now, when we try to figure out how many people have bipolar II, the numbers can be a little all over the place. And this is mostly because different studies use different methods. For example, a massive World Mental Health Survey found a rate of 0.4%, while a big meta-analysis that combined lots of studies found a much higher number, around 1.6%. But here's one thing that is remarkably consistent no matter which study you look at. Bipolar II disorder seems to be more common in women. For instance, one huge study found that about 2/3 of all the people diagnosed with bipolar II were female. And that brings us to our final and maybe our most important section. We need to talk about the real-world course of this illness and its impact, because it's time to completely debunk the dangerous myth that bipolar I2 is somehow a milder version of bipolar disorder. This chart shows you the typical journey a person might take. It often starts with these vague, early symptoms like anxiety or irritability. Then it moves into a stage where it's dominated by depression, often for years, before that first clear-cut hypomanic episode finally shows up and reveals the true diagnosis. And because of that long, slow, confusing start, we end up with this next number, which is just staggering. The average delay between a person's first mood episode and getting the correct diagnosis of bipolar II is between 8 and 10 years. Think about that. That's nearly a decade of suffering and getting the wrong kind of help. So let's just put that milder bipolar myth to bed once and for all. The data's clear. Bipolar II is associated with, in some cases, even higher levels of functional impairment than bipolar I. People with BD2 spend much more of their lives in a depressive state, and their risk of dying by suicide is at least as high as in bipolar I. This is a severe, debilitating illness, and that's precisely why getting the diagnosis right is so incredibly important.